If we look at this image, what do we see? We can see Asiatics are depicted in a range of skin tones. So Asiatics doesn't necessarily mean white. Now let's go back and see what is said about Asiatics from this video.
These men were erased from history. Who they were, and whatever they accomplished, vanished with them. All that remained is the tale of the victors, who depicted them on the palette of Narmer to commemorate their victory. And the knowledge we have of them is the one mentioned on that palette. We have their phenotype, straight hair, aquiline noses. We have the name of their location, a walled city which is mentioned here next to this man and was certainly located in the delta because of this symbol mentioned under the falcon. It is the reeds, symbol of Lower Egypt. How old was it? We don't really know. There were numerous...
So as can be seen, Asiatics were attributed to inhabiting Lower Egypt during Predynastic times, and were conquered by Upper Egyptians who are depicted as Black African. This story was reinforced on Mr. Imhotep's page and was even reinforced by the king's monologue, who stated Levantines are depicted on Narmer's palette. However, the story began to change. There was now a new story. Now Black Africans from Upper Egypt conquered Black Africans from Lower Egypt, and now there was a small minority of Asiatics in the Eastern Delta.
On the left, it is the palette of Narmer, which is well known. It depicts the Kemites taming a serpopard, symbolizing chaos. This suggests that the indigenous people successfully conquered the entire territory. The men depicted represent the natives and the elite of the country. This is another palette from around the same period. It is called the battlefield palette, representing the defeat of the enemies of the southern pharaoh and their capture. So, these men represent the indigenous inhabitants of the Delta region. If you look carefully, you will notice that on both depictions, the men share a similar phenotype with a little twist. Both the victorious Upper Egyptians and the defeated Lower Egyptians have afro hair, meaning that a big portion of the Egyptian population was black. In other words, we have black people in the south and black people in the north. Keep in mind that all of these palettes Lower Egyptians have afro hair. All of them. Once again, there is a lack of racial diversity, which makes a very strong statement. There may have been some people with different phenotypes around the Eastern Delta as those being defeated and executed by Narmer here, but it looks like they were a minority of the population living in the Eastern Delta in the beginning. The modern argument.
So why was there a change in the story of who inhabited the Delta? The simple answer is, Mr. Imhotep earlier kept reinforcing that during early dynastic times the Delta was inhabited by Asiatics who ended up becoming high officials in the Egyptian dynasty. This is before the so-called Asiatic invasion during the 11th and 12th dynasty. Just to add, Mr. Imhotep made it clear on his page that there was no invasion of Egypt by Asiatics during those dynasties, but actually a mass migration of people from Asia during that time. So was he correct? Was there a small minority of Asiatics in the Eastern Delta during Predynastic times and the rest of the Lower Delta Black African? What does cultural evidence show? What does craniometric evidence show? The cultural traits of Merim place the Delta Neolithic between the Saharan and the Near East with very strong connections with Levantine traditions, which can be seen around sites like Madi, Wadi Digla, Heliopolis, and the Giza. The inhabitants of Madi practiced husbandry. They maintained commercial links with southern Palestine and Upper Egypt. The peculiarity of semi-subterranean houses, as well as the presence of copper and Levantine artifacts, suggested to some researchers that a Levantine colony was established in Madi. The links between Buto and the Near East are further supported by the presence of fired clay cones similar to those already known in the Uruk culture of Sumer. So we can see since beginning from the Neolithic there was Saharan and Levantine connections in the Delta region, mainly in the western Delta area, and we can see it goes from as far as Buto all the way to Madi, which is near Cairo and Giza. So what was the phenotype of the inhabitants of the Delta? Was it mainly black African, as Mr. Imhotep implies? Craniometric studies show that northern Egypt shows a phenotype that is intermediate between Upper Egyptians and Europeans. So when there was a mass migration of Asiatics into the eastern Delta during the 11th dynasty, shown in the image is green, there were already an Asiatic Saharan African presence already there in the western Delta, as shown in the locations in blue since Neolithic and Predynastic times. So now we have to ask ourselves this question. During Predynastic times, did Asiatics migrate into Upper Egypt, or was the Asiatic presence only in Lower Egypt?
That had those ideas already and spread those ideas into centuries.
So, if we have these Sumerian artifacts in ancient Egypt, could it mean that a Sumerian population lived in ancient Egypt at that time, and that they looked like modern Middle Easterners? We know the sites from which these art pieces have been found. Therefore, to answer that question, all we have to do is examine the anthropological analysis from these cities to see if it aligns with that theory. The pieces came from Nakata, Bad Ari, and Abydos. Now, what do we know about these areas?
When we look at Mr. Imhotep's other sources on the Badarians, we are told that the population of Bad Ari was a hybrid population of individuals who have curly, wavy, and most importantly, the part that he left out of his video, straight hair. When we look at cranial studies on Nakata, a difference is noted between the Bad Ari sample and the Nakata samples, in which it is attributed to many things, including migration of northerners into Upper Egypt, who Mr. Keita already stated showed African/European phenotypes.
You have all of these skeletal remains, and you have this background of people that we know were there. It does not mean, as you have heard correctly from me, does not mean that there was no back migration. What it means is that the concept of the Egyptian is assembled on African soil. Now, the thing is, I would imagine that some of the people will tell you that the Egyptians were simply, if they use a word like black or simply indigenous, that many of them are quoting Cheikh Anta Diop. Is that right?
Yeah, a lot of them do.
Okay, but then they don't know Cheikh Anta Diop very well, because Cheikh Anta Diop clearly says in the translated volume that was put together by Mercer Cook, The African Origin of Civilization, which is based primarily on the French book, The Antiquity of Black Civilization, or something like Black Nations and Cultures from 1953, 54, 55. Cheikh Anta Diop says there was an infiltration of whites from Palestine during the Amrashan period. Cheikh Anta Diop says that. That's in the English edition too. So if you have a copy of the book, just go to find those pages, and then the next time somebody says that, they say, well, wait a minute, even Cheikh Anta Diop says it. He says it straight up.
In which period was that?
In the Amrashan, otherwise called Nakata too.
Okay. Oh, so in the Predynastic.
Yeah, so Cheikh Anta Diop says it himself.
Of course, he still believed in the whites and black thing.
Well, okay, now, this is where it gets very tricky with Cheikh Anta Diop. When Cheikh Anta Diop says that the ancient Egyptians were Negroes from the beginning to the end, you have to understand, number one, when you read it in French, I think you get a much better idea. I don't read French very well, but the flavor of what he's saying comes across in a very, very different way. Because what Cheikh Anta Diop is saying is this: the foundational population was indigenous. It absorbed other elements. Absorbing other elements doesn't change your identity if they're thoroughly absorbed. And this is what he is actually saying.
So he's more using Negro as a cultural identity?
Yeah. Remember, the book was translated by Mercer Cook, who was a black American, and he's an older man. Mercer Cook was professor of Romance languages and literature.
Archaeologist Emile Emilino write the following after excavating royal tombs there. There aren't many items in this section, but perhaps they make up for their small number by their price. First of all, there is the small head of a wooden statuette shown on plate XXXI, number 1 in the lower row. This head was found, I remind you, in the same tomb as the stele of the king I called the Serpent King. Then he adds this. The head is complete and the statuette goes down to below the breasts. It is a statuette of a woman and of a Nubian type of woman. All those who examine it will, I believe, agree. The forehead is quite low, the face angular, the eyes small, the cheekbones prominent, the nose slightly blunt, the mouth wide, the lips thick. So, we see that phenotypically, the populations of these areas were black African. The kings even practiced a Nubian culture.
You're not blind, are you? Did you not notice in his first two examples he used anthropological studies, but in this one he used a statue to represent the population? Why didn't he just use a craniometric study like this one from Kemet that shows there was lower Egyptian types and Maghrebian phenotypes found in Abydos, along with European phenotypes? With all the evidence provided, it's clearly obvious that Upper Egypt during Predynastic times was greatly diverse, as Kemet and Diop said, and that Lower Egypt did not have a minority Asiatic presence, but in fact a substantial one. So were these Sumerian artifacts imported from trade? Maybe, maybe not. They could have been made in Egypt. Take for example with the Gebel El Arak knife. Mr. Imhotep clearly points out that there are Mesopotamian type boats on it, but for some strange reason he forgot to mention the Egyptian type boats at the bottom of the knife. Furthermore, if we are to assume because they have Mesopotamian images on them they are imports, then that must mean that Narmer's pallet is also an object of trade, considering it also too has Mesopotamian images on it, such as the serpoparts and the Mesopotamian style of drawing bulls. Or the reality is that there was an African and Asiatic culture that intermixed, creating not just the Narmer's palette, but Egypt as we know it.